Let's start technique of the week: salt and pepper, seasoning, that type of thing. We've talked about acid on the program before. Of course, seasoning, a couple things that I see all the time: salt and pepper to taste, and of course, salt and pepper itself. We hear them all together every time you open a cookbook, every time you're talking about food. S&P, salt and pepper, this is what you need to do. So we hear them together a lot. The strange thing is they're incredibly different. They are kind of your table usage, and if you grew up like me, I grew up with salt and pepper in the shakers. And what that means, this is not a hit on you, Mom. That's what everybody did. What that means is I grew up with crap, because table salt is crap and table pepper is crap. And I'll explain why. But just so you start breaking down why they're different, salt is a seasoning. Pepper is a spice. So think of it this way. Salt is going to enhance or bring out the flavor of something. You know, when you put salt on a wonderful steak, it should make it taste more meaty, more beefy, and not salty. Pepper actually adds flavor or changes flavor. So one is making something more tasting like itself, and one will actually change it. And depending on how it's used during or at the end of cooking something, you're going to get a different brightness and a flavor change in that pepper. So salt also has chemical ramifications, meaning that it will do certain things to your protein as well. So in this case, if you're making a steak, as I talked about, that salt can actually change the meat, and because it's a muscle. So it's used in brines. I prefer a dry brine myself. I think wet brines are messy and unnecessary. I think the same thing happens in a dry brine. It's just slightly different. You put the salt on there. That salt chemically is going to pull out the juices. Those juices are going to mix with the salt. The salt's going to start to break down a little bit, and then it's going to be assumed back into the meat. And that will cause the big flavor burst. Now, you can put all kinds of other things in a brine, and that's a dry brine as well. They don't get sucked in the same way as the salt does, but they all add flavor and things like that to it. So salt does have a chemical reaction as well. You don't want to salt like a ground patty for a burger, for instance, too soon. Or too long, rather, before you put it on the grill, because it will tighten up and it can change the texture. So those things are a chemical reaction. The actual flavor that's being added to it is enhancing. So those two things are separate. They just often go hand in hand because they're just really good together and can get most of it done unto itself. I have heard from many people that cut salt out of their lives or minimized it, that they just started peppering things. And in peppering it, the mind told it, hey, pepper's there, salt's there too, and they stopped using salt. I've messed with that a couple times myself. I was impressed by how much it does do, but really it's not getting salt on the food, which is delicious, and quite honestly, your body needs. It is imperative to the way the electricity works in our body and the way we control water balance and the like in our body. Salts come in two basic categories. You have sea salt and mined salt, but all salt is technically sea salt, meaning that all salt came from the ocean at one time. Believe it or not, there was a lot more ocean at one time on the planet. If it was happening now, we'd all march and say, save the ocean, save the ocean. It's reducing. But then again, most of us couldn't be here underwater. The parts where the ocean has constricted, there is left salt in the land, and then it's mined from there. But that does change. It does change the quality of the salt. Sea salt is incredibly flavorful. I went and did a salt tasting because I'm weird like that of maybe a dozen salts. And I was surprised at the variety of salt and the flavors that can come with it. I have probably the largest collection of one thing here in my house for cooking is probably salt. I have a fairly large bin of finishing salts, kosher salt, all kinds of smoked salts and things like that bring different flavors. But ultimately, you have those two categories. You have sea salt and then mine salt. Sea salt is fresh from the extracted fresh from the wet sea, and has very little additives to it, if any. And mine salt, or you get table salt from a lot of that mine salt, and that has a lot of additives to it, whereas you won't find the same. Even though they have the same saltiness and all of those attributes to it, you can get something more flavorful and saltier, I guess, out of sea salt than you would out of mine salt. All right, we'll come back. We'll talk more about salt, pepper, the usage, when to use, how to modify both of them, depending on if you're using them in the finishing process or during the cooking process. So go nowhere, as our technique of the week is salt and pepper and seasoning. Right now, a technique of the week, we're talking about salt and pepper seasoning. We've talked about acid and the importance of acid. I think acid as a home cook has been one of the things that I feel, actually seasoning as a whole is one of those things that we kind of pinch and pray, kind of pinch some, throw it in there, and hope for the best. And well, it tastes right. And then every once in a while we build a salt bomb or something and we're screwed and we don't know how to back ourselves out of it. And it's usually Thanksgiving or something when you're having tons of people over. So acid, salt, and pepper are going to be three necessities when you're cooking. And then you can get into all the other things, and we'll do that at another time. It's just salt and pepper seem to be synonymous. You always build them together. Salt and pepper this, salt and pepper to taste, all of these things. As we talked about briefly, salt is a seasoning, pepper is a spice. So think of salt enhancing the flavor. Pepper can change or add flavor. Salt comes from one place, comes from the ocean, but it does have many forms that it takes. You have the true sea salt, which is extracted from the wet sea, and then you have the stuff that is dried and needs to be mined out of rocks and caverns and all of these things based on the fact that the sea was there at one time and is not anymore. Pepper comes from a peppercorn, and although we refer to it as a spice all the time, technically it's a fruit, and then it's dried out and it's ground. And, for instance, I use a lot of Tasmanian pepper. There is something about it that I find to be magical. It's kind of chameleon-like. It adapts to whatever I'm cooking or using it for. I think it's got this sexy aroma, when you smell it in its peppercorn state or in that corn state. And then once it's freshly ground, it is just like a cacophony. It's hard to kind of pinpoint what you're smelling or the things that you're tasting in it. But I personally love it, in addition to all the different types of peppers that I have here in the house as well. And there are many. You've got the red peppercorns, the white peppercorns, green peppercorns, and these are going to be different states of ripeness, and depending on that and when it's picked or how it's dried and all these things, you're going to get different flavors out of that as well. This is separate from the pink, what's referred to as the pink peppercorn, which is altogether different. But the usage of them, and it comes down to a key point. I talked about earlier, growing up and having the salt and pepper shakers. Usually it's table salt, and I've argued with people about this. Some people really love that nasty table salt. I don't. I find it to be metallic and nasty. And but you're going to have the grain size or the corn or the grit, the size of the salt. You can also do that with pepper and when you're grinding it, as to doing a finer grind or a heftier grind. All of these things, the key is that with pepper, it's got that oil in it, and when it's fresh, it's fantastic, but the shelf life is short. So that stuff that you're keeping in a container somewhere that's broken apart, those oils they can go rancid actually, but they're also going to start to dry up, and it's going to change. That's why that nasty table pepper that we grew up with kind of became sandpaper at the end of the day. So finally, when using, you'll hear chefs all the time talk about layering flavor. They're salting, adding salt as they go and letting it kind of marry with what's in there in the dish before you decide to add anything more. And chefs, man, it's such a thing of beauty to watch them season a dish, because as home cooks, we're fumbling and trying to figure these things out as we go. Pepper can be slightly different in the sense that it's going to have a different flavor whether you're using it early on in the dish or at the very end. If you I love to grill. If I'm grilling and I put the pepper on prior with the salt just before going on and doing a reverse sear that we've talked about many times here, is one thing, because once I put it in that searing position with the high heat, it's going to change. It's going to change. The oils are going to start to cook. You can burn pepper, things like that. So if you're adding pepper at the very end, it's going to be a much more potent and flavorful steak in a different profile than it would be if you put it on and then sear it at the end. We'll get into salt and pepper again sometimes, because it's one of those things I'm constantly trying to learn more and more, and I wanted to impart those basics to you today.